Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to our session that spotlights the work of Sandra. My name is Keith Berry, and I'm a professor and the current graduate director in the Department of Communication at University of South Florida. Year and a half in, year and a half left. That's what I'm telling myself in my head. Nevertheless, I've known Sandra for some time, and so when Carolyn and I were kind of brainstorming combinations of people, Sandra came up first in terms of this encounter. And I'm like, all right, I need to do that. I want to do that one. And so I'm just really, I say that to say that I'm very excited and honored to be able to speak to our with our dear colleague and to talk a bit about autoethnography and narrative and creative and experimental work through Sandra's work. And so let me read this blurb, which was perfectly conveniently listed over research on Sandra's CV. And so Sandra is, who got her PhD from Penn State in 1999, is professor of media and communication at Bowling Green State University, past administrative posts there in Women and Gender Studies, director or assistant director, if I'm not mistaken. But Sandra's research, writing, and advocacy primarily focus on close relationships and relational communication. She incorporates theory and research from a variety of interpersonal, sexuality, health, feminist, and culture literatures to interrogate sexualities, identities, and relational expectations and forms. She focuses on the role on the role of culture, discourse, and identities and how these influence relational processes and understandings. She engages with critical qualitative approaches and community-based research projects to examine how individuals negotiate stigmatized and marginalized identities in their relationships and communities, and the tensions that must be negotiated. She is the author of 12 books. 6 of those are sole authored. 6 are co-authored, and I believe I counted 1 book in press and another one that's under contract. And that tires me just thinking about it and stating it. Sandra has also achieved scores of journal articles, book chapters, other creative modes of writing, creative, experimental, reflexive, and talks and lectures. And she is also vice chair-elect of the Interpersonal Communication Division of the National Communication Association, which is our largest organization in the communication discipline. And we will likely come back to that latest bit in a little bit as we're talking. And so we had a conversation in preparation for the discussion. We've got a path. It'll be interesting to see if we stick to it. We envisioned the dialogue and then with some core questions, and then leaving time to branch out into a larger discussion. So with that being said, are you ready, Sandra?
I am.
All right, love.
Yeah.
So everyone loves a good origin story, right? The beginnings. If you're like me, you find it impossible to identify just one. But I was interested in thinking about Sandra's some formative earlier experiences that led her to come here and stay within this community. And so, Sandra, what brought you to narrative and autoethnography?
Actually, recovery from graduate school. So I noticed that you had mentioned that I graduated in 1999.
Mm-hmm.
I was at Penn State, which was a pretty I was going to say stodgy. I guess I can say that now. But, even then, in terms of interpersonal communication work, what was the norm was variable analytic work. And so I had done a dissertation, a grounded theory, which at the time, which doesn't seem that radical right now. Like if I think about qualitative kind of critical work, and if it was along a continuum, my dissertation was like, really far right. And my work has gone right a lot in the opposite direction. But at that time, it was really radical just to even do a qualitative piece. And so I don't regret I was trained at pretty classic social scientist, right, at that time. And, I learned a lot about, right, the importance of, doing deep reading, learning the rules, right, which I think are necessary before you start to break them. But, so anyway, so that was how I was trained, and then, I just assumed that was the kind of work that you were supposed to be doing. But, I started to be a bit dissatisfied with, right, some of that writing. I was looking for a way to piece together some of the kind of disjointed, academic versus personal versus the kind of writing that I was doing versus the kind of questions that I was interested in asking, right, about close relationships. So fast forward a few years. So I had a tenure track job, which I quit after a year to go do a postdoc. I don't know that I would recommend that to students right now, but anyway, it was like 2000. There just seemed like there would be a lot of jobs. And anyway, during that time, I ended up taking some community poetry writing classes, right? And I was still doing like postdoc kind of work. But at some point I was trying to figure out, well, how do you meld, right, some of that creative work into some of the academic work, and took a few steps. And I also remember reading Lyle Crawford's work, Personal Ethnography. It was published, I had to go back and look this up as I was thinking, and if you haven't read this, it was in Communication Monographs in 1996. And in that piece, Crawford talks about an encounter that he had watching someone get attacked by an alligator. Right. And it was this, this personal narrative, but in that, then Crawford talks about how right, he didn't use the term autoethnographer, but right, this is kind of a precursor to that. Crawford talks about then not leaving the field. So going into the field and then not leaving it. And then I was also reading some of Dan Rose's work. There's a really nice little thin like sage book. It was called Living the Ethnographic Life. And so it was reading some of this work and then thinking, hey, well, maybe I can do that. Maybe I can find an academic voice that feels more real to me. Because when you do some of that, I had that, again, that kind of training, I just assumed that this academic voice was not personal. It was something, objective, it was distant, and it didn't have, much to do with emotions, with vulnerability. So that's kind of the origin story. So I started, using poetry in my work. I don't think that I had published, I was just trying to think about using, personal narrative and creative nonfiction. And I don't think I published any of that till quite a few years later. And I also will say that when I was doing some of the, poetic inquiry work, right, in the early stages, I had some well-meaning mentors who told me to keep that stuff off of my vita. That if I put that on my CV, then somehow it meant that I wasn't going to, right, get jobs, or that I wouldn't be taken seriously. So my advice, right, to some of you, if you're wondering about doing that work, is I always thought, well, you have to do what feels right and some of the questions that you're asking. But I was also really careful to try and publish some of that work in outlets that I knew would somehow, and I'm gonna put this in quotation marks, that was somehow would be respected. And by the way, I didn't leave it off my vita, because I figured, well, then what's the point if I'm gonna, be someplace where that kind of work isn't respected. So I guess I would say that was, kind of a circuitous kind of path, right, toward doing the work I wanted to do.
Nice. And I think your lived experience presents a model for some folks in here, or that who listen to the recording, that where perhaps they feel trapped and unable to do this sort of work in their program. This could be something that those folk pick up once the degree is finished. you know, given your history, I think it demonstrates a model of clearly successfully doing that, but yet having that foundation. Uh, so not all these questions we are prepared, of course. So that's kind of what brought you to narrative and autoethnography, right? This idea of recovery, as you framed it, right? What made you stay?
Because of what it can do for your work. And so I had just talked about feeling kind of disjointed, and this I was on this search for this idea of academic voice, right? Because you would hear this like, oh, well, you know, you've got to have an academic voice, you've got to do this. And you know, what was interesting to me as well is that the pieces that have gotten the most cited, or that, you know, people would write to me about, because, and by the way, you should always write love letters, or not, you know what I mean, to scholars' work who you admire. And I try to do that as well. But, you know, I would get notes, but it was all the poetic inquiry and the personal narrative thing. Because by the way, I still do publish some things that aren't necessarily personal, you know, got some pretty traditional, like, you know, focus group work, et cetera. So I still have, you know, some of that kind of qualitative work. But the pieces that tend to get cited and read the most are, right, the narrative and the poetic inquiry kind of work. And so, but what it does, right, for me is it lets me be vulnerable. I think that it also makes me, I think within there, I did find an academic voice. And what that academic voice is that it is vulnerable. It is emotional, right? It does, right, convey things in the ineffable, right? What I have found is that, particularly in poetry, because for me, poetry is the language of emotion. It's how I tend to best, right, make sense of things. And I found that actually is the academic voice. And so for a long time, I was like, oh, here's this academic voice, and I'm going to try to make it fit in with poetry. And then I would get, you know, feedback from other poets that are like, you know, this is kind of crap. I mean, they would say it kind of nicely. And then I realized that, well, maybe that academic voice really is this vulnerable kind of emotional voice. And I, you know, and this kind of distant, whatever I thought this objective voice isn't, right, the academic voice. The other reason that I stay is that it actually makes me a better teacher too. And so a lot of times when we talk about pedagogy, and we talk about you know, being good teachers, we you know, talk about this idea of the scholar teacher. And, you know, people use that term a lot, but for me, it really means that it's this seamless kind of integration of the work that I do, but then how I'm teaching. And I'll tell you that for my students' work the past few years really blows me away, because I have them do poetic inquiry, I have them do autoethnographic projects in the classroom. And, you know, I found that then they're able to use, you know, more of their voices. And also when I bring that into the classroom, then they respond more. You know, nobody likes to read real traditional, well, I mean, I do sometimes, right? But when we think about like academic articles, but the students, I mean, they don't respond to that. And so I like to bring in theory and things, right, through the creative, right, through the autoethnography. And then it seems to me that you're doing what you want to do in your work, right? That if you're trying to evoke something, if you're trying to have people feel something, if you're trying to have them actually understand someone else's experiences, right? There's a lot of research that suggests that when we think about creative work, when we think about fiction, when we think of, right, about poetry, that's a way into understanding in ways that maybe more straightforward prose or academic articles or like more traditionally written textbooks, right, can't do. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of why I stay, is that it is more of a way to kind of meld all the parts of myself, right? So it's really difficult to kind of flesh out, well, here's the scholar and here's the teacher, right? And here's the poet. And I think that all of those things are important to my way of being, right, as an educator. because I'd have to say that that's probably my primary identity, right? Even though some of it shifts, but I identify as an educator, and that's something that's really important to me.
Well, and I think it comes across in multiple ways, including in some published work. I thought it might be a moment to if you wanted to talk a little bit about the new case study book, but before you do, I should say that the first edition of this book, which I was honored to have a chapter in, that was largely written in collaboration with graduate students, right? Or a lot of those pieces were, which I think is really an interesting kind of story. But would you tell us a little bit about this, either that process a little bit, but also about this new one that is, if I'm not mistaken, just out this week?
Yes. Oh,
Or
I
soon.
know. Say, or my cop. I was gonna. Oh, hold on. I was gonna show y'all. It's on my bookshelf. Oh yeah. I have to have it. Sorry, right? So it's out. So this is the second edition. What's interesting about the first edition, and there were quite a few pieces, actually some from undergraduate students as well as graduate students, but that made it a difficult sell, right? Because we still have this, credentialing, right? That's really important, right, in the academy. And so the idea was like, well, who do you have that's known, right? Like known scholars, et cetera. And there's still, so that's something maybe we can get back to. But in terms of this second edition, what I find really interesting here is that, right, these are all creative case studies that are really critically oriented. So we have some work, I see Tony Adams there. There's some work on, their personal narratives. There's some poetry. There's a comic. And by the way, the comic is from an undergraduate student. It was their project on grief and how they remembered when their grandmother had died when they were really young and not understanding things about death and grief. And then, later, and it's written in the form of a comic. And I was like, we absolutely need that there. But none of these, so this is a text that I use in relational communication, but none of these are straightforward like theory pieces or, necessarily journal articles. You can get that by, through the way that you teach it. But I think the topics, there's, in a letter format about, Palestinian experience, right, and intergenerational trauma. There's a piece about negotiating non-monogamy. There's pieces about explicitly talking about class, right, in close relationships. There's pieces, about Black motherhood. How do we talk about race and health, right? Health disparities. But that's in the form, that was a piece by Mary Weems, which is in the form of a play. So I think, what's exciting here is that you can talk about, some really important issues through these, through autoethnography, through narrative, right? Through this way, and students respond well to this. And I'll just say one more thing, really the impetus for doing this in creative case studies is that I had used a case study book, and I'm not trying to bash some other scholars, but just to say that I used this, and it was written, there's some case studies, but they weren't creative, right? So it wasn't like personal narratives. It was like, maybe, a scholar might take, oh, here's this piece on self-disclosure, and then I'm going to try to write this case study. So it didn't actually come from personal experience, or it wasn't right. And students didn't respond. They would somehow make fun of, somebody in the case study. And I thought, wow, we really, and it wasn't, I think, the students' fault, but I thought we could do better, right? And that was where it was kind of born out of. And I will say with, the first edition, and I'm going to say even more with the second edition, that students respond to this, and, there are real issues. And these are ways to open the dialogue in the classroom to be able to talk about this.
Feels very teachable.
Yeah.
That's what I thought from the TOC. Thank you. So I wanna, based on what you said there, kind of veer towards what narrative and autoethnography do for your work, for your inquiry generally. But I think another stopping point is helpful. Let me put it this way. What is it about you and change? And here's why I ask. And movements and change. Injustice, I want to put in there. At conference, we spend a lot of time together. There's never been an interaction that I've seen, even with someone you don't know, who has faced some sort of injustice, that it has not just utterly pissed you off, and in which you've responded in ways that wanted to know how you can help. This idea of leaning towards justice, the rightness of it, and I see this happen in other ways, kind of trickle into our worlds. For example, and we were recapping this the other day. So Dr. Faulkner has the first autoethnographic piece in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships. A very difficult journal with impact factor, in quotes, big, to get into in general. If I'm not mistaken, your special issue that you edited with Beth Suter of the Journal of Family Communication was, if not the first significant contribution of autoethnography there. And then finally, I mentioned this at the opening, Sandra is, as of this past November at our NCA conference, vice chair-elect of the Interpersonal Communication Division. And that is a division that, to my experience, knows very little about the idea of culture and therefore marginalization and therefore exclusion. That's a remarkable event that I think we're only starting to get right now. Because before now, folks like us had to go to different divisions, right? We had to identify in the foreground the method, perhaps, and not the conceptual idea, if there is that clear delineation in the first place. So what is it with you and change? Is not really the ideal question here, but I see you as living out this blurring of the personal, cultural, and political that so many folks who work with autoethnography identify with and use. And so could you speak to maybe some of these things, and I'll stop there with
Sure.
ellipses.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. That makes me feel kind of good. So, the hardest question that I ever got on a job interview, I think speaks to this. And so the person had asked me, why do you research what you research? So this was the question. I remember sitting there at dinner, and then I was just, kind of flabbergasted. Yeah, I shared the piece Better Nostalgia that you were talking about in the chat, if anyone wants to take a look at it. And I just remember feeling flabbergasted, and I thought, well, really, I study things that piss me off, right? That things that somehow I feel kind of angry about, and so, or fired up about, or feel kind of passionate about, which is why I always tell students too, you're gonna, if you're doing a thesis or a dissertation, you need to do something that you're interested in, right? Not something that you think is going to get you a job, or that you think I want you to study, or right, because I'm not as interested in, I came from Penn State, and so the idea was that if you work with someone, then you're going to be doing some of their research, or you have to have like little Faulkners running around. And I think that, and I see Cody, you're in here, right? And I hope that you would bear this out, that I'm not interested in a legacy like that. And so I always try to tell students, you've got to study something that you're passionate about. So I always remember that job question, right? And that's how I answer it. And so, it's also interesting. I never thought that I would see a poetic inquiry piece, which, has it's an autoethnography in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships. And especially for years, I've identified as an interpersonal communication scholar. I mean, I have since, I graduated in '99. But for years, I wasn't even a member of the interpersonal division, because many people there did not consider what I was doing interpersonal scholarship. Right. Or it was like out there because it wasn't variable analytic work. I didn't, I wasn't doing, structural equation modeling and this and that, because those weren't the types of questions that I was interested in.
And you weren't generalizing, right?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
And you weren't generalizing and doing work leading.
Exactly. I mean, even though what I would argue about good autoethnography, good poetic inquiry is that you generalize, or actually you're able to universalize through the specific. It's those specific details, those, that people relate to, that then makes it universal. So, I mean, I wouldn't use the term generalization, and certainly, from my traditional social scientific training, right? People say, oh, you can't generalize, but there are that's why people respond to it, right? Because somehow you've gotten at something that's universal through the concrete specific details that you're discussing, right, in your work. So, yeah, and it's so funny because there was even, there was some book and somebody was talking about Carolyn Ellis, and then they had mentioned me in the same sentence, and they're like, yeah, I'm doing qualitative work, but it's not way out there like Faulkner. And I was like, way out there, like what, what does that mean? And so
purple boots.
Yeah,
glittery boots that are.
Yeah. Oh, I think right, because I'm sorry, I dressed up and put a hoodie on for this conference. Yeah, I haven't worn a suit since I was on the job interview, on the job market.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that I answered some of your questions. So that piece then that ended up, so this was published. Butter Nostalgia is a piece that was published in JSPR, and Journal of Social and Personal Relationships. And for those who don't know that journal, it's a pretty mainstream, hard to publish in relationship journal. And I know that they've not published any poetic inquiry. And it was a special issue on COVID. And what I think is fascinating, and I give props to Pamela Nudi and Jen Bevan, who were the co-editors, because they have some structural equation modeling, but then they have some qualitative work, and then there's this poetic inquiry piece. And so what it feels like to me, and this, I think you were saying maybe given advice, is that I think you should go for the questions that you want to do and the approaches that feel right to you, and find some mentors, right? I'm always happy to answer questions. I, occasionally, usually about once a month, I'll get, an email from, a student, et cetera, who's not right at my institution. And I always try to, reply back to that. I'm also on external reviewers on many committees where people are trying to do poetic inquiry, or I was on a dissertation at the University of Toledo because somebody was like, hey, I'm doing autoethnography, but no one on this committee understands. And so I ended up being a committee member on that. And so that was the other thing I would say to students and stuff, is there are people then who will can help you if they're not at your immediate institution.
Love it. Yeah. And congratulations again on those three things that I think are really worth marking. And I put very cautiously that they demonstrate that change can happen. And I don't mean that in a Pollyanna sense whatsoever. I mean, I was, very briefly, I was just, I'm happy that I was recently promoted to full professor at USF, and I'm the first gay full professor in 40 years.
Terrific.
Ever in the department. Now, I don't know. Yeah, I'll celebrate that accomplishment, but also the other side of that's kind of bullshit. The other side of that kind of speaks to the systemic heterosexism and homophobia that's part of the process, and I could begin to name names of recent full professors of color for the very first time in 40 years. And so, where do you go? Where's the outlook in terms of, the change possible and the movements and the bullshit that it responds to, I suppose. But I'm going to set that down for now.
Well, and that just reminds me of what Norm Denson, if some of you were in that session this morning, and Denson was, well, I can't quite remember the quote, but basically you need to do, right, you need to be invested, you need to be doing something. And I think, Keith, at this point, right, in our careers too, and I know that you do this, like really take seriously the idea of mentoring, right? And that's an important part of the work that we do.
I agree. So what have, on a different note, what have been some reactions to your work? We hear stories from many autoethnographers how there's a difference between writing it and or putting it in print or performing it on stage, right? Something shifts when it comes to the audience. I think of the piece I published on the gay bathhouses and the gay body, which actually came out of Craig's queer theory class at SIU back in the day. I think Carolyn's has written on her abortion and also how she had to stop assigning it in undergrad because of the questions. And I confess I've taken a pause on the bathhouse piece for the undergrads because I don't want them picturing me naked in a towel soliciting sex. Just a little old, even if it's titillating. But what have been some reactions for you?
Well, some of it's been positive, but I can focus on the more vitriolic responses, and those responses have been the pieces that I wrote on motherhood, right? The pieces on critiquing white motherhood, mothering, what it means to be a mother. And so, one thing I'll say about method for those of you, when I started saying, oh, I'm going to include poetry, I'm interested in like creative nonfiction, I started taking a lot of workshops. And so I took some through the Creative Nonfiction Foundation and many like poetry workshops, et cetera, to really work on craft. So that said, I was working, and Keith, this was in a special issue that you had published on Home Place. I can't remember, but it was a piece.
Queering Family Home.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it was so it's a special issue of cultural studies, critical methodologies. But I was in a creative nonfiction workshop, and this piece has some poetry, but it's a creative nonfiction piece that talks about the first year of my daughter's life. And I'm just going to say that 12 and a half years in, I'll knife you if you fuck with my daughter, but I do not love being a mother. So I'll just say that, right? Never really intended to, et cetera, but it was particularly that first 4 years were difficult, but I was writing about that. And it's a very bold, unnostalgic look at insufferable infancy. And also my kid was kind of terrible. I mean, we talk about it now, and I said, you were really terrible. She never slept. She was colicky. And, now I understand that I had postpartum anxiety, which is something we really don't talk about, which is, it's kind of related to depression, but, so it was pretty miserable. I can't say that I enjoyed any of it, but I, was writing about that. And, I bring in some of the literature on attachment and, attachment theory, like, oh, you have to do all this stuff to make your kid secure, or you're going to be a bad mother. And so anyway, that's where the piece is kind of going through these like middle-class white notions of good mothering, et cetera. Okay. So I'm in this creative nonfiction workshop, and, I'm workshopping this piece, and this was it was through like Google, a Google platform, and there was one person in there who then just suddenly like went off and said, this piece is the worst piece that I have ever read. If I was an editor, I wouldn't publish this piece. And it's just going off about how crappy this piece is. And it's interesting because you can see like people kind of gasping, et cetera. Like, you can see the screen toggling back and forth. And, just this, person was going on. And I will say that this person was workshopping a memoir about his mother, right? And in the piece, his mother's pretty flat because his mother's like, oh, she kisses his boo-boos and she loves him. And, I don't mean to totally go off, but it was like the character was really flat. And so, later the instructor was like, oh, are you all right? Are you all right? And then I was like, I'm absolutely used to getting some of these reactions as a feminist, but what that said to me is that that piece was doing exactly what I wanted it to do. I was and later, the person went on and said, well, you have just ruined my altruistic vision of motherhood. And so that's what it was about was, okay, so we just made this, it wasn't, all like love and rainbows, right? But it was, a real portrait of the struggles. And I've had other reactions too. There's another piece where I talk about being ambivalent and pregnant. And and by the way, I don't tend to use that in my undergraduate classes either, because some of the dangers I think about this work is that people assume that because they've read that they know you, right? Or that, right, it's interesting because you use some of that voice, even though I'm really careful, like when we think about ethics, like what I put in and what I leave out, right, of those pieces. So because I've had reactions then to the, the ambivalent pregnant piece too, where students said, well, you made me feel bad about myself. You're a bad mother. I mean, and as if any of this has anything to do with, right? How would you know I'm a bad mother? You haven't seen me, right? You haven't seen me mother. But again, it's because it's critiquing certain understandings of what it means to be a mother, right? And by suggesting some things that, well, you don't really like the role and it's really difficult and mothering sucks, and that somehow that means that you're a terrible person, right? Because you've just critiqued some of that. And so those have been some, and by the way, the person that had critiqued me then later like emailed me, and we had some correspondence for a bit. And then I had said, well, by the way, that piece actually got published. So, there you have it.
Yeah, the first one was in qualitative inquiry, right? The ambivalent motherhood. Yeah, I think that's a go-to example for me of using the method, working with the method to intervene on normative conceptualizations. And it works every time I use it, if it helps to know for folks in class. I told you the other day, it's hard for me to unsee mothering after having read your piece, knowing what I used to think about it. I used to think I was a pretty decent critical thinker, but there was something about the way that you presented it, including form, that really did that for me. And remember too, and during the editing process, I think I came to you, I said, hey, are you sure? Is that what you want there? And I believe I was embodying the normative conceptualization. I was editing and looking out for you just to make sure, but I remember being self-conscious about how much pushing I was doing, because I was So, but the use of story to be able to poke, and disrupt and unsettle. And speaking of form, you had mentioned some interest in, and maybe speaking a little bit to how kind of your creative process and how form comes to you. And perhaps a bit about what role creativity plays in that. And I bet a bunch of people could benefit from hearing a different perspective. So
yeah, so what I would say about that is I think it's good to practice whatever form that you're into, right? So I spend a lot of time on narrative and creative nonfiction and poetry, because those, and actually recently I've been doing a lot of collage work where I have incorporated text and image, trying to push some of those, and particularly I had just redid the idea of a baby book, and Tony, I know that was part of it was in a special issue of I just forgot the journal, but I've been working with some of those images more.
QED.
Yeah, that's right. QED, I forgot, sorry. And so sometimes when I'm starting a piece, I really don't know, oh, this is gonna have some narrative here and some poetry collages here. It's like the butter nostalgia piece, right, that I had shared. I didn't know that it ended up being almost like in a journal format, and then there's some poetry that's overlaid over family recipes and photos. It's a piece where I talk about spending 11 days with my parents right when the COVID lockdowns happened in March of 2020, and talk about some of the difficulties of navigating the daughter role and the spouse role and the mother role, and all of those kind of competing interests there. And so what I'll say about the creativity process then is that I think you, sometimes I write toward a goal. So then I had discovered, I saw this call for the papers for JSPR for this COVID and relationships. And I thought, wow, writing about that time with my parents seems, interesting. But again, I didn't have it. So then, and that summer I was working on, some, another kind of poetry project. And so I was doing, some collage work there. And it wasn't like I knew that all of this was going to come together into that project, right? And so when I think about creativity and work, that's what I was saying. I think that and that goes back to the idea of, never leaving the field, right? And being like, I'm an ethnographer. That's what I do. And that's kind of my being. And so I'm always creating. I'm always, I used to journal a lot. Now my journaling tends to be poetry snippets, etc. And so I'm always doing that. Sometimes it ends up in my work, sometimes it doesn't. But that creative process then allows me to, when I'm doing then something that might be more academically focused, I'm able to sometimes bring some of that in, right? And I find that my obsessions, some of my personal obsessions then end up being some academic obsessions, right? I never really thought, oh, I'm going to write about motherhood, right? But that was just one way to be able to understand it. And then I started, as somebody who studies close relationships, what's in some of that close relationship literature, and I wasn't seeing, some of that work. So it's good to have creative practice. It's also good to have writing habit. So I don't know that we've talked about that, but I always tell students this too. Writing's even, any kind of creative writer will tell you this, like you have to have it as a habit. You have to schedule it into your day. It's not like motivation isn't enough to get you there. And so at the beginning of every semester, I always look at, okay, when am I teaching? When do I know that I have certain meetings? And then I block off time, right? Whether it's a whole day. And so, I try not to schedule meetings, but I know that that's the time that I'm going to be, doing some poetry, doing some writing, and that's part of the creative process too, right? You've got to have that time in order to allow that to happen. And it's really kind of the nuts and bolts, and it's really unglamorous and not sexy, but, I write that into my calendar. Like, this is this time. So that's also something that I would encourage. Yeah, and I see Angela, yeah, you should have a writing schedule. You need to work on what you feel passionate about. Absolutely. You're on mute.
Yeah. As we're about to move to Q&A to end our session, I think I told you I was going to ask you a couple fill in the blanks. One is, to your experience, what's the biggest misconception about autoethnography?
Oh, that somehow it's not theoretical. I know that Art Bachner has talked a lot about that, that somehow it's not real scholarship. Mm-hmm. And thirdly, that it's easy.
Yeah.
And I would actually say that I think it's harder than some of the more straightforward kind of qualitative work that I do.
Mm-hmm. And then the one I believe I did tell you is, I am an autoethnographer because. So kind of circles back to the why you stayed, right? Like what?
Because it makes sense, because, it allows me to be fully human, because I have lots of questions.
All right.
because it's who I am.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you. And we have this time reserved until the end of the session for comments, questions, ideas, anything provoked by the conversation or just things that come to mind in general. And thank you for the folks in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, so do you want to? I saw Angela, Deborah, and Cody's hand up.
Yeah. Do you all wish to give voice outside of chat? You're welcome to.
Yes, Sandra, I would just like to say regarding making change. I was the student at UT that you assisted as a methodologist because nobody there had published. And now there are 2 different faculty in the communications department that do autoethnography.
Oh,
so
that's terrific.
even though that was the first dissertation they had ever seen that actually, got through, it was noticed and other people do it now. So yay for you. Thank you.
That is terrific.
Thank you so much.
And I'll have to brag, Angela's dissertation is amazing. Amazing.
I'll at least note for the room JP Levengood's comment. I can say that Sandra has always been inspired by what makes her angry since 1991. One of my favorite moments related to the mom piece is you coming each May to ICQI with the latest thing about mothering that ticked you off. And my favorite one was when you felt compelled or roped into being in charge of the Girl Scout cookie sales.
That is, I am working on a memoir, memoir on feminism. And that Girl Scout cookie has a prominent role. Let's just say that being Girl Scout cookie mom is it's like the mafia. Like the Girl Scout cookie is a whole. Anyway, that's a story to come.
It tickled me.
Yeah.
Cody, you want to give voice to your comment?
I think Deborah was before me, but go ahead, Deborah. Then I'll jump in. You okay?
Oh, thank you. Kia ora. I'm down south island of New Zealand in Aotearoa, and I wrote in the chat as well, but I just wanted to put some voice to thank you very much for your amazing presence woven throughout our evolution of creative autoethnography. I use arts-based autoethnography a lot. The one question that I have revolves around this sense of resilience, because it is an embattled, fringe walking, edge walking profession that we are pioneering as we do this work. And it's come to my notice through the students that I run the research program within our creative arts therapy masters. And many of our students, pretty much all of them, use arts-based autoethnography. And a lot of them are moving into territory that is incredibly contested, that is trauma-informed, personal life stories that are difficult to tell. And it seems that there is this division between those who have that secure sense of self as such a crazy, needing to be unpacked concept, but I'll use it as a shortening. That sort of resilience, that sense of self that enables them to tell their stories and go out there with them. But it's often the very storytellers who need the stories to go out there, the stories that we haven't heard, that often have experienced that primary early trauma that disables them from going there or having the stories out in public. And this really came to head in an article that I was an editor for in our Journal of Creative Arts Therapies, the journal for our region, where 2 peer educator come creative arts therapist arguing for a peer-informed way of doing creative arts therapy came to me in great anxiety about putting their article forward, because it disclosed these personal stories. And they've both done autoethnography in all sorts of veins, but truly diving into the stories that need to be told and heard created such distress for them. And you know, for me, it's, yes, we need to grow the field so that it's more hospitable, so that they are held by a community. But it really, once again, threw up that huge contestation that we're always grappling with colonization and with you know, destruction of spaces for the marginalized, and the colonization of those spaces by the remarginalized, and how we do this and don't, you know, I don't even have words for it, but just that conversation was so disquieting for me, because we had to really plumb into, why can I stand in these spaces and tell my stories? And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I didn't have some of those shitty experiences as a small creature who needed to be nurtured and loved and cared for that you've had. And so my traumas came later. I was formed enough to be resilient to now tell them. And you know, and that really opened a wound for me that needs some attention. Anyway, I'm just throwing that out there.
Thank you. And I think that that's where mentoring becomes important, and why I do some of these exercises in my classes, right? Because students, they can see that. And then, you know, I always tell students they've got to trust in their own voice, and maybe they've never heard that before. And so I just keep, you know, just keep repeating that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll jump in now. Thanks, Deborah. So Sandra, I've been fortunate to have you as a dissertation advisor, mentor, friend over the last many years. But I think my question for you is, and I mean, it's almost more like a statement, but I want you to kind of elaborate on it more. You know, I had a good mentor once, which was you, tell me, you know, if you're going to teach these arts-based research things, if you're going to step outside of your comfort zone, if you're going to engage in autoethnographic practices, you have to believe what you're doing. You have to believe it in the classrooms. If you don't believe it, your students aren't going to believe it. So, and I think that that's what a lot of us face when we're trying these new and different things is you know, how do we enter the space of difference? So could you speak to how, or give some tips to others to maybe enter that space of difference inside of the educational classroom and mentoring others?
I think that's where it's good to, and I mean, I'll put in a plug for, you know, the creative case study book, but there's, you're right. I think you have to, you know, believe in it, but also, you know, tell students that you kind of walk them through. So when I do have them do poetic inquiry, or I have them do, you know, a creative nonfiction project, and by the way, I let them do TikTok videos and you know, things like that as the final project. I walk them through this, like, okay, this is going to be a little bit different, but in class, then we're going to do some of these exercises where I'm going to have you brainstorm, and I'm going to have you free write, and and I show them a lot of examples, right, of, you know, video as method, and, you know, not just the poetry, but, and through those examples, they see that other students have done this. And, you know, I'll keep you know, I always ask some of the students whose projects I know that are going to resonate with future classes, can I use this, right, again? And so you're allowing students to do that. But you're right. First of all, you do have to believe in it, right? So you know, I just say this is scholarship. I mean, we don't, I don't, unless it's a grad class, right? I don't tend to have a lot of, you know, discussions right that way. And so, but also just kind of incrementally, step by step, kind of walking them through that. And then also just, you know, again, telling them to, you know, trust in their own voice. And if they hear that enough, and then they see you, you know, trusting in your own voice, and then, you know, you're mentoring them and encouraging them, it works. Or at least for like 90% of the students. I still have some students that are like, what is this poetry stuff or whatever? And I'm like, well, you know, that's fine.
And on that note, we have used up our session and some bonus time. I hope if you ever have a chance to sit or walk with Sandra Faulkner at a conference, ICQI, for us at NCA, for COM, or here, I hope you'll take advantage of that moment. She's an academic and just a damn good person. And so it's been my great pleasure to do this little part in bringing this conversation to us all. So thank you, Sandra.
Thank you, Keith. And please
Thank you.
email me if you want to continue the conversations.